I'm Scott Lachlan. This is the Data Chronicles, and here are your data points. This is the third installment of our deep dive into the DOJ's proposed rule that would restrict U.S. cross-border data transfers to China and other named countries of concern. This rule is really a big deal for global companies. And as a result, we wanted to cover it from multiple angles. This episode is coming in a package of three. Our first episode provided an overview of the rule and, frankly, what we could expect of the proposed rule in light of the changing administrations in the United States. The second episode focused on what the proposed rule means for global compliance programs and data protection programs in particular. If you've not listened to those two episodes, give them a listen. They do a great job outlining the proposed rules requirements and the general impact that they will have on global businesses. This episode is maybe a bit different than the first two because it will have a specific focus on the health and life sciences sector. While the rule is industry agnostic, it applies to all US companies and all US industries. That's not to say that it will have the same impact on all industries, because the rule has proposed requirements that apply specifically to sensitive data, including health and genomic data and biospecimens. And as a result, the proposed rule will have a significant impact on the health and life sciences sector, especially those companies operating globally. To discuss that angle, I've invited my partner, Mike Druckman, to the podcast. Mike is a member of our health and life sciences practice and spends his days advising global life sciences organizations on regulatory matters, including those who are inquiring about this new NPRM. Mike, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Scott.
So, Mike, I'm so happy that you're here because, as we've been talking about this NPRM and the potential large consequences that it will have, I think the life sciences and health sector in particular is going to be one that has to watch this carefully and will likely have a number of obligations that, frankly, other industries will not. So maybe just to level set, can you help me understand what the current scope is of global operations for big life sciences organizations, and where are the connections between global pharmaceutical life sciences organizations and China and other countries of concern?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. It's important to keep in mind that life sciences companies, in particular pharmaceutical companies, biotech companies of all size, are really in a global ecosystem. The supply chains for economic efficiency, companies have gone to the most efficient producers of services. And as a result, we have companies in the United States that are very deeply engaged with contract manufacturers, testing labs, suppliers all over the world, including the companies that are targeted by this proposed rule, China in particular. The biopharmaceutical industry and its organization, Bio, has made clear, has surveyed its members, and a great percentage of them use Chinese contract manufacturers for much of their manufacturing. And many of the critical drugs are dependent on these services. And so as a result, the industry, life sciences industry, and the healthcare industry generally has evolved to be completely global and interdependent, which is really one of the reasons why they're included within this rule, because they could be, I think, the Department of Justice thought this could be, a loophole where bad actors could exploit some of these chains of data that are necessary for applying and achieving approval of these critical medicines around the world.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good and interesting point, because as we are thinking about the global nature of how these operations work, And that, plus the fact that it appears as though, as you're suggesting, the NPRM, while it's broadly applicable to all industries, kind of everybody who is operating across borders and has any connection to these countries of concern, it does call out the types of data that is most likely to be in the hands of big healthcare organizations, big pharmaceutical companies, big device manufacturers, and so on. And so it uses some of the same language that we would see in traditional privacy laws, sensitive personal data, genomic data, DNA, all of these different types of things. Interested in your perspective, if this set of rules are to go into effect, what impact do you see on those global operations of life sciences organizations?
I think it could actually have a very big effect. The rule itself, as you were alluding to, has two categories of data that are called out as sensitive personal data that are intrinsic to the healthcare industry and life sciences companies, particularly pharmaceutical companies, biotech companies that are developing some of the most cutting edge cellular and gene therapy products and medical devices, human genomic data and personal health data. These are necessary for those companies to do, that's how they operate. Just for example, to run a clinical trial, you necessarily have to obtain, analyze, and then provide to regulators these critical genomic data often, or biospecimens. So that's part included in the rule are biospecimens, so specimens of human origin that like tissues and cells that contain DNA. And sometimes you have to provide regulators with actual samples of your raw materials and of your final product. And so it intrinsically includes some of these genomic data. And just the bottom line is they're intrinsic to the fundamental to health records and the health industry generally. So the rule really gets at the heart of this industry. And because of the prohibitions, absent an exemption, the rule would prohibit any U.S. person from engaging in what they call covered data transactions. It would provide one of these listed countries of concern, or a person controlled or affiliated with one of these countries of concern, like China, with access to what they call bulk human genomic data, or, as I mentioned, biospecimens from which this genomic data could be derived. So we can get into the details of what is prohibited and what's exempted from the prohibitions, but the bottom line is it's really at the heart here, both the rule and of this industry.
So maybe just an example which would illuminate this some way, because you were describing, hey, listen, it's not uncommon for US-based pharmaceutical companies to engage CROs that are based in China, or to do clinical trials based in China. So if I'm envisioning here, we have a US person, right, that US pharmaceutical company engaged in a position where they are sending perhaps data that they get worldwide or from in the US to a clinical research organization based in China, either in the way of health records, in the way of DNA data, or in the way of biospecimens. That relationship, which is common, is now going to have additional restrictions and potentially be one of those restricted transactions or prohibited transaction, depending on how it's set up.
Right. Well, as you were alluding to, there are companies, both U.S. companies and foreign companies that are managed by or have controlling U.S. persons who very much rely on a full global clinical trial. So you have subjects or human patients that are being tested on in all over the world, including China, Russia, Cuba, some of these countries of concerns. And so sometimes just to be allowed to run the clinical trial in the first instance in those places, the companies need to provide the prior human data that's already been achieved. So if a US company starts with a very small, typically you test drugs, you start with a very small patient population, very small size. And so you might start in the US with a small number of patients. Then you get the data and it shows that it's safe. And so then you use that initial data to support the authority to test it in a much broader population, including other places. So in order to convince a Chinese regulator, for example, that we should be allowed in the first instance, to run a clinical trial in China, we might have to send the results of those initial trials, which is human US data, to those regulators. Sometimes you have to include how you've manufactured it. So it includes data on the manufacturing process. And as you alluded, it could also include actual specimens of some of the products for the regulators to examine. So that's just one. And then what happens is they run the trials and they're all the data are integrated and analyzed together. And so it's very important to be able to have free flow of information, including in that direction.
So, I mean, it's fascinating, Mike, because I think what I'm hearing you say is, maybe someone who says, well, this is not going to really create an issue for me because all of the data that I have about US persons is not really the subject of the clinical study that I'm doing in China, or I'm doing in Cuba, or I'm doing in Venezuela, or doing in Russia. Instead, like, I'm taking that data and I'm sending it back to the US or to other countries. That's not subject to the rule. And I think what you're saying is, yes, but in order to do the underlying research in China, you would have had to send US person data in order to get that study approved in China, or to have all of the data be analyzed appropriately by your CRO or by any of your vendors. Thus, even if you're doing the clinical study or trial in another country that is subject to this rule, you're still likely to get picked up by the scope of these regulations.
Exactly. And to take that a step further, many of these companies use foreign service providers, CROs, contract manufacturers, even for a solely US trial. And so it could be that in order for those vendors to perform their job, it's necessary to send them the data that they will work with and the biospecimens to do testing on. And so those companies, if they fall within the definition of, covered person, could very well fall within the rule, even for a solely US trial. But it's particularly concerning to companies that are relying on a global market and a global patient population.
Talk to me about that contract manufacturing component, right? Because I think that was obviously a big issue that came up during the pandemic, and a lot of scrutiny that came up around how is it that the US healthcare system, and in particular the pharmaceutical system, is based on the manufacturing of life-saving medication outside of the United States, and that would create a national security issue. How much, from your perspective, results in the actual transfer of personal data to allow for the manufacture of these products that the US rarely relies on?
Yeah, well, as you pointed out, it became very clear during the pandemic how integrated and reliant US pharmaceutical companies, biotech companies are, particularly on Chinese contract manufacturers. So it turns out that a number of the companies there have, invested a lot of resources into becoming extremely efficient in what they do. And some of them have developed and then have intellectual property rights covering the what's called master cell banks that are used to produce some of these products. And it's become the case that these companies, many in China and then in some other places, are very critical to the manufacturing process and will sometimes do all of it, or sometimes just very critical pieces of it. And it's become a concern. And clearly some of the policies that are being developed, and this rule is reflects that concern, but there's something called the Biosecure Act, which is being debated in Congress and may still yet be enacted this year, possibly. And there's trade policies. All of them are aimed at that concern, that we are too dependent on some of these countries that, in the geopolitical atmosphere that we have, are adversaries. And that should they make a decision one day not to supply, we'd be in in a really bad situation. So we do foresee this onshoring effect, where there's going to be incentives for U.S. companies and other foreign companies that are not these countries of concern, not in these countries of concern or controlled by them, to step up, to build more manufacturing plants, to improve their expertise. But one last thing is that it's going to take some time, and the efficiencies and expertise that these foreign companies have developed, which has attracted the U.S. companies, takes years sometimes to fine tune, to adapt, sometimes to acquire the rights in order to do it. And so it's not an easy process. It's not something that you can just say, oh, well, we'll switch. Particularly in the gene therapy, cellular therapy areas, there's a lot of knowledge, a lot of intertwined rights and know-how that will take some time to transition to U.S. companies or other non-countries of concern.
Yeah, and I mean that's a really interesting point on the implementation, which I want to get back to in a moment. But that geopolitical point that you're making, including kind of why is it that this industry has perhaps gotten more scrutiny than others in a very different context. You mentioned the biosecure conversation, the kind of the conversations that we've had around the pandemic. You know, this to me is kind of fitting with inside of that larger debate, but really coming at it from a different angle, because I don't recall in the 400 pages of the NPRM that there is any reference to say, you know, that we're putting these rules into place to incentivize organizations to onshore their manufacturing or onshore their drug development. Instead, it's very much focused on the national security component of cross-border data transfers. Interested in your perspective is why the healthcare system, where do you think that in particular is creating those national security risks that the government is concerned about?
Right. Well, I think some of it is just actual evidence that some of these companies have used the personal sensitive data for malfeasance, for cyber attacks, for capturing data on individuals in order to put pressure to scare people, to have influence. And so these countries that have been singled out have actually done it, and have done it in this space. And there have been evidence that are concerned that some of the human data, including U.S. human data, has been shared with like the Chinese Communist Party, with the military, and there's some very serious concerns that this could be a funnel of, if they exempted out this industry completely, which some of the comments call for, or at least for some portions of the kinds of products that they produce, that it could be a huge loophole that these companies are very well positioned to take advantage of. So I think the rule is very much trying to strike the right balance, to prevent loopholes that will just vitiate the rule completely, but not to cut off the kinds of very important foreign interactions and foreign markets for business reasons, but also foreign sources of information, such as these global clinical trials.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the other thing that I would be, interested in your perspective on this is, in drawing that balance that you're describing, I think many folks would point to the reference to bulk, and that, isn't this really a rule around those large scale, gigantic data transfers? That's not what I do, right? And so, the meaning of bulk here perhaps could be a bit of a misnomer, in my view, about what a layman's definition of bulk is versus perhaps what bulk means in the context of this rule. Interested in your perspective on that, especially as it applies to some of those sensitive data categories?
Yeah, that's a very important question because it could be misleading. So in the context of human genomic data, one of the called out areas, the bulk threshold for what constitutes bulk is actually not that much. It's data on over 100 US persons. And that's the limit on the aggregate over the preceding 12 months before one of these covered data transactions or transmissions of data, such as an application to get approval. So in the drug and biotech world, that's pretty low. I mean, most clinical trials of any size have more than 100 subjects. And when you're talking about doing testing on other samples and a lot of other things, it could be much more than that. So crossing that bulk word doesn't really save this industry from being hit and covered by this rule.
So then let's maybe talk about the other exceptions, right? Because you mentioned that there were other exceptions that were perhaps not, or that were designed to try to address this imbalance or trying to strike the right balance, maybe is a better way of describing that. And you mentioned maybe bulk is not the right way of thinking about it. That's going to save this industry. What about some of the other exceptions that were introduced in the proposed regs?
Right. And there are two main ones that DOJ clearly intended to be tailored in the right way. The first is an exemption for regulatory approval data that are necessary to obtain or maintain regulatory approvals in these countries of concern. And those are the data and information that a company has to supply to a foreign regulator or any regulator in order for that regulator to grant marketing approval. And there is an exception for those data, but the problem is that it's probably not sufficient for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is that it only exempts de-identified data. And unfortunately, the rule doesn't, many of the comments pointed out that the rule doesn't really define that de-identification in this field with enough precision or enough clarity. Plus the fact that pretty much however you might define it, it still would be an obstacle. For example, there are many foreign regulators that require access to those identifiable records. The US FDA, for example, has to have access to the raw data, what's called case report forms, which is where the patient information is actually recorded so that they can test the integrity and ensure that it's really valid data. Well, same thing goes with foreign regulators. So in many cases, it's just not permitted. It wouldn't be feasible completely to de-identify all the information. Plus, for things like biospecimens, you can't. I mean, the DNA code within cells of our body is unique to each individual. And while you couldn't just take a random cell that you found on the ground, so to speak, and say, oh, that's this person's, if you have some other databases that link that very unique genetic profile that is unique to each individual to any identifiable information, then that could then disclose who the individual is. And in this global digitized world, that's a very common fact that is out there. But unfortunately, we read in the paper so often that there are these cyber attacks and these data breaches where people's individualized information in healthcare systems, in biopharmaceutical companies gets stolen and then released publicly. And so it's not all that hard for a foreign country to make the connection between this human genomic data and that can be found in biospecimens and your individual people's identities. So and then there are a number of other problems, one of which is that although there's that exemption, it doesn't exempt vendors that are covered entities. And so even if you could, and most, as we talked about before, most of these companies do rely on vendors. Many of our companies controlled by, located in, associated with these countries of concern. And so even though, so a pharmaceutical company might be able to submit the data only if it does it completely itself, which in today's day is just not a feasible thing. All companies use some sort of contract manufacturers or other vendors for something, testing or all that, the many different aspects of getting a drug approved. And so it sort of gives and takes away with one in the same hand. And then there are other reasons why the rule is maybe not enough protective. One, for example, is it only protects data that are necessary for the approval. And that's a subjective thing that could leave much of the data that the companies need to develop and include that, someone might get judged that, well, the regulator didn't really rely on that. So is that really protected? So the bottom line is there's a lot of gaps in the way it's defined. And there are a lot of comments trying to get DOJ to adjust for those. But the problem is that many of those adjustments would open up loopholes that Department of Justice would be rightly concerned about.
Yeah, loopholes, and frankly, that they would be going into areas where there's just not a clear solution. I mean, we've been in the privacy space, have been arguing about what constitutes de-identification and anonymization forever, and nobody can agree on that, especially globally. There are different standards that are set out. Some of them are more onerous than others, and if you were to ask data scientists about how well those actually stand up when it is that you're looking at the data that's being provided and what other data may be available in the world, especially as much of our data becomes online and digitized. How can you find one data set and combine it with another data set? Really difficult set of issues, such that de-identification is one that I think it will always be an area where there's disagreement. Thus, I don't think the DOJ is going to solve for that here. And, the relationship between vendors, as you're describing, I mean, all of these things are just really thorny points that, the DOJ has kind of stepped into privacy questions that we've been having for a very long time. And even though they want to say that this is not a privacy law, and it's certainly not intended to protect individuals' privacy, they are finding themselves in those privacy debates for which there is really no clear answer.
Right, which is really a disincentive and a problem for companies that are on the cutting edge of innovation. And two other quick things I wanted to say. One is another example, which is very important, is what's called pharmacovigilance, which is monitoring the safety of a drug or a biological product, medical device, after it's been in the marketplace. And there are requirements in all jurisdictions to ensure that there aren't problems. And very often, no matter how large a clinical trial is, it's discovered that a drug can have side effects at what's called adverse events, causing adverse events that weren't detected at the testing stage. And so there is that exemption we talked about. On its face, attempts to exempt some of those things if it's necessary to maintain the approval, which this pharmacovigilance, this collecting of adverse event data is. But unfortunately, it's not really carefully enough crafted. And so for reasons like the de-identification reason that you mentioned, it might not be possible to exempt that reporting. Just for one example, that often a regulator needs to have access to more specific data about the identity of the person that experienced those side effects in order effectively to manage the problem. And so that's just another example where this rule could have unintended adverse consequences.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, as I think about this, Mike, I mean, this is a fairly complicated set of obligations, on an industry that already has a lot of obligations and regulations on top of it. And so, as I think about this and try to kind of say, all right, what is it that we would do? As prior episodes, we've laid out that, this is in its proposed form. There have been comments that are submitted. The DOJ is going through those comments. We expect that there is going to be a final rule prior to the change of administrations, and that the new administration may very well, continue on this path, given that I think it has maybe more bipartisan support, given the national security angle. So with that, maybe as we close here, what do you think that representatives inside of a pharmaceutical company or a life sciences organization should be doing at this stage in preparation for what likely will be a significant sea change on global data transfers?
Yes, that's a great question. And we are receiving questions already from the industry that we've been helping companies strategize through. It might be a little premature to make any kind of major changes before the rule is finalized, but because of the length of time that it would take to implement any sort of strategy to work around the impacts of this rule or legislation or trade policies, it's going to take some time in planning. And so there are, for this rule as drafted anyway, there are some ways that could be strategies that could avoid it. You could break up clinical trials in ways where you would segment the data and try to pull apart the locations. You could change your supply chains and the sourcing to ensure that only U.S. biospecimens go to U.S. and you don't send any to foreign countries, and you have an alternate supply. And the rule also has a provision for licensure, that if you really can't get around this, you could apply for licensure, but that has its own burdens. And, that's something that, we get questions, and we have folks that can address those sort of things. How might you get a license? I mean, I was even contemplating the possibility that it could be an advantage. That is, if for a country that's really on top of a company that's really on top of things, that foresees the definite need and gets prepared and is one of the first to get a license, they might essentially be the only one available, able under this rule to exploit that country, that patient population, not exploit, but leverage continue to leverage in the way that it's just naturally grown. So it is definitely not too early to start thinking about the strategies, examining, getting a good grip on one supply chain and clearly understanding all the different levels, because, the foreign companies, even outside of these companies of concern, countries of concern, might have relationships with covered persons people related to or in these countries. So the supply chain has become very, very complex. And sometimes it's not so easy. We've done due diligence where really finding out what a particular company, the extent of its contacts with companies outside of the U.S. is a time-consuming and sometimes tricky endeavor. So examining it now and preparing the options is really a prudent thing to do. It's to be ready for whatever changes that are going to be enacted or promulgated or developed.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's going to present its own challenges, and probably the one that's going to require the most amount of time and lead time for organizations to be able to get out ahead of that. It's almost like, the old line that we probably have seen in movies where it says, the investigator says, "We'll follow the money." And maybe that will resonate for all of the folks who are listening to this, who have a sanctions background and are thinking about this from a traditional trade perspective. Maybe we use that concept and now it's follow the data, right? Because trying to understand where data is coming into your organization, who is collecting that data on your behalf, and where they are located, and perhaps what systems they are touching with inside of China or any other countries of concern. I mean, that itself is a really difficult question, especially for organizations who are operating really large businesses. And that to me is going to take a fair bit of time just to unravel, for them to go through and implement the type of restrictions, the type of technical safeguards that the rule requires, the types of limitations and contracts that the rule requires, and frankly, the type of firewalls that probably will need to eventually be built. We have to architect Rome here in some ways, and that's not going to happen overnight.
And the government regulators are going to be learning along with this development. And, it's even reflected in the language of the rule. Another exemption that I didn't go into detail on, but is for clinical trials themselves, not getting approval, but to do the clinical trials themselves. But it's actually, I believe it was intended to allow for global clinical trials where there's a U.S. site and it's going to be producing data for the U.S. and for the U.S. FDA, but where it also has sites and approvals outside the United States. But there's a lot of ambiguity in that exemption. And I think it's very difficult. I think the regulators were very much struggling with how to craft it in a way that would strike the right balance and would prevent the transmission of data that would be problematic, but yet allow the global clinical trials to proceed. So I think you're absolutely right. It's a complicated situation that's going to take some time and analysis on all parties. And so it definitely would make sense for all companies. And we have many companies that we see already have undergone that process. So all the steps that you mentioned, examining the contracts, examining the IP, following the data, is definitely something that companies are pursuing and should continue to do.
Well, Mike, really appreciate your insights. I'm sure we'll be talking quite a bit on this rule and how large healthcare organizations are going to be responding, not only in response to the notice of proposed rulemaking, but when we're actually going in ahead and planning for the implementation itself. So hopefully you'll be back on a future episode, but really appreciate your insights on this one.
It was a great pleasure. Thanks for having me, Scott, and look forward to hearing the future podcasts.
With that, I'm Scott Lachlan. This is the Data Chronicles, and those were your data points.